Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. In the last section, we got introduced to the topic of ethics, introduction to ethics. And while we were there, we talked a little about moral realism and moral anti-realism, a little bit about David Hume and his particular ideas of where morality comes from, and then a little bit on Kant. Today we're going to focus on Kant and deontology. But also, there we introduced the idea of free will compatibilism and determinism, and hopefully through some of the videos and that you watched on that particular topic, hopefully you began to wrestle with the question of are we free? Do we actually make moral choices? Any choices really, but we're focused on morality, so do we really make any kind of moral choices? And then if not, what are the consequences? If we are free, what are the consequences? Is there a combination there with compatibilism? Are some things determined and others free? And how do you figure out when something is determined versus when something is actually a free choice? And hopefully you had some compelling insights as you sat and watched the videos. Hopefully it started making you think about that. As always in my classes, the decision is yours. You can decide for yourself which of those three particular stances it is that you fall into. That is for certain. And today, what we are going to do, what I want to focus on, is Kant and his deontology. And so I wanted to start delving in a little bit there and trying to get his ideas. Remember that in the introduction video I talked to you about moral theories, or what I called ethical engines there. I described the Dr. Seuss machine. You throw a situation in, it huffs and puffs and it blows something out on the other end. And Kant and deontology is that first ethical engine that I wanted us to look at. And so with him here in deontology, just trying to begin thinking about these different ethical engines. And so with deontology, the word deon, D-E-O-N, comes to us from the Greek, and in Greek deon just means duty, or it means obligation. It's something that you have to do. Remember us talking about the phrase, the starry sky above me, the moral law within me, and then the word there for law in German was Gesetz. It's something that you had to do. It's an obligation. It's a command that's given to you on a battlefield by your commanding officer. And so with deontology, it's something that's not a choice. It's a duty and obligation that goes deep inside of yourself, and it is part of yourself. Now here with Kant, there is certainly going to be an aspect of free will, that you are going to be able to choose to do something else, that it's not going to be a deterministic position, but that you have the ability to decide, and in Kant's case, you have an obligation to do what's morally right. So this is going to be a duty-based ethical theory, which usually considers outcomes immaterial, or at least secondary in that moral assessment. Now what that means is that when Kant is using deontology and he's trying to say, and we ought to do ... one of the things that we should not consider is the consequence. We should not consider the consequence, but rather our actions should be pure. And so in Kant's case, for example, he's going to say that we should always tell the truth and not worry about the consequences of telling the truth, but that we have a moral obligation to, in fact, be honest and to tell the truth, and at all times. And so with him, we shouldn't worry about consequences, because consequences can mislead. We could possibly justify some immoral action because it brings about a good consequence, and he wants to be sure that we don't run into that particular kind of issue. Now, there is one, kind of taking two positions here that are opposites. Deontology being the one that says never consider consequences, and later we'll look at utilitarianism, where they say that consequences are primary. They're what matter the most. So I'm kind of purposefully taking both extremes here so that you can kind of see the importance of both ends, and perhaps then figure out what position you take based on these two different extreme positions. And so with Kant and deontology, again, don't consider consequences. Simply, he says, and he says, he doesn't say, but this is a good way to sum him up, that's what I mean, that we should be good for goodness sake, right? Now that phrase, good for goodness sake, perhaps sparks in your mind a Christmas tune where Santa Claus is coming to town and you should be good. Why? Well, you should be good for goodness sake, for the sake of goodness itself. Now, Kant is not here saying that you should be good so that Santa Claus will bring you presents or so that some other good ... will come out of your actions. Remember, you shouldn't consider consequences. So it's not about being good for the sake of goodness so Santa will bring you presents, but really it's being good for goodness sake. Why? Because you should be good. Because good is good. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to be. And so be good for the sake of goodness. We should keep our promises. We should fulfill obligations simply because they are promises and they are obligations, and not because of any particular anticipated outcomes. Just because you expect something good to come from you fulfilling your promises or obligations, that's not why you fulfill them. You fulfill them because they're promises and obligations, and that's why you do it. And if something bad is going to come from you fulfilling promises, you should do it anyway, because consequences here are unimportant, or they are at very least they're secondary. There are three key elements to deontology. First, how we arrive at a moral decision is entirely rational. So we're going to use nothing but logic. In that sense, Kant said we need to work out the right thing to do just like we can work out a mathematical proof. And so working out a moral right or wrong can be done just like we can work out a math problem, according to Kant. And so you can sit down before a moral situation is, before it occurs, before you wind up in that situation, you should be able to sit down and think about what the right or wrong thing to do would be in any given situation, work it out logically like you would math, and then you'll have the answer before you ever get into that situation. Now, just like mathematicians can sit down and write out a mathematical formula and prove that it's true, and then at the same time say it's true, we have nothing that's useful for, it's just true, and lots of mathematicians will do this just because they sit down and work out some kind of mathematical problem and it makes sense and it's right and hooray, and then they stick it in a drawer because there's nothing that we need it for. But what will happen later is that another scientist, say an engineer, will come along and they'll say, hey, I need a mathematical proof for this because I'm working on whatever. And they'll go over to the mathematician drawer and they'll pull it out and they'll say, hey, look, this guy, he made this mathematical proof a long time ago. He didn't think we had a use for it, but wouldn't you know what, I need it because I'm working on this over here. And so you can work out moral rights and wrongs just like you can work out more mathematical issues, mathematical problems. You can work out moral issues before you ever get into that situation. And so Kant said you can work it out. It's mathematical, just be logical, straightforward, don't worry about consequences. And that's the first thing. The second key element to deontology is that, we did it just like you can, that these things can be worked out mathematically. That's the first one. The second one is that since you can work them out mathematically, you can work them out ahead of time. I kind of lumped 1 and 2 in there together. So the first one is that you can work them out mathematically. The second one is that you can work them out ahead of time just like you can math. And so that's number 1 and number 2. The third one is that it is based on respect and purity of motives, not on the desirability of the effects or results of actions performed. That means that we're trying to you have to look solely at the motives of the individual and not look at the consequences of what that person has done. Now, basically what he's saying is that if their motives are pure, if they did it for the right reason, even if it brought about bad results, if they did it for the right reason, then it was morally the right thing for them to do, because you have to look at their motives and say, they were trying to do this, and therefore it was the right thing for them to do. Now, if their motives were pure, but they have to be pure. And again, with Kant, and thinking about that purity of space and time, right? And purity here meaning not involving other things, right? If you have pure gold, it just means that you have nothing but the element of gold, say, in a dish or something. And the same thing with motives. They have to be fully and completely pure, in the sense of that they weren't considering the consequences. They weren't trying to do something in order, say, for example, to get the applause of others. And so if you climb up into a tree and rescue a cat, um, if I'm doing it simply because I want to rescue the cat, then those motives are pure. But if I'm doing it because there is a pretty girl standing on the sidewalk, and I know that if I rescue her cat from that tree, then she'll give me a kiss, well, then my motives are not pure. I'm not doing it because I'm simply wanting to rescue the cat. I'm doing it because there's a pretty girl here who's going to kiss me, and so now I've got some type of other motive. And so you have to consider the motives, and the motives have to be purely and completely pure in this case. And uh, so number one, the three key elements of deontology. The first one is that they can be worked out rationally, like mathematical proofs. The second one is that you can work them out ahead of time. And the third one is that your motives have to be pure when it comes to deontology. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Well, we've looked at Kant. We've done a little bit of his background, his biology already, but just kind of thinking a little bit about him within his deontology. Certainly the key figure in deontology, the most important writer, is Immanuel Kant. His dates are 1724 to 1804, and he is attempting to derive a system of ethics that does not depend on religious faith or experience, but can be worked out rationally. It can be worked out using logic. Now, remember us in a previous video, it seems like there was a discussion on Kant and his particular religious persuasion, and it was almost made to look like that Kant was an avowed atheist and even despised religion, and that simply isn't true. It's just not the case that he despised religion. He often despised the established religion, the religion that was used, and I'm going to say, and abused people of that day. Certainly Kant is going to be against abuses of all kinds, and if the church, in this case it was Christianity, so if the Christian church was somehow involved in abusing people, then certainly Kant was going to be opposed to that. But that doesn't mean that he was an atheist, and in fact, most of his writings, as you look in his writings, it seems that he believed in a deity of some sort. And exactly what that looked like, I have found trouble trying to figure out exactly what I thought Kant understood with regard to a deity. I also think that that's not necessarily unusual for most people. Well, that's probably not true. For a lot of people, that's not unusual. For me personally, I've gone back and forth on the question of the deity. The most important aspect of the deity for me, the most important struggle for me, has always been the level of activity of the deity, like how involved, how can you tell if the deity is or is not involved in acting in some particular way? And what will happen is that one week I'll be convinced that the deity is active, and then the next week I'll be convinced that the deity has forgotten about humanity. And so my position has and does change over time. And so the idea that Kant came in and had one belief with regard to a deity and never had any other beliefs, that he was just this one thing for his whole life, is really pretty silly, because a lot of thinkers struggle with a lot of different issues, and they change their mind, and they change, and they develop over time. And so with Kant, the same thing I think is going to be important to recognize, is that he can change his mind. And so if you read one thing in one place and you read something else in another, maybe what that means is that when he wrote that 5 years before, he thought one thing, and then 5 years later he thought something else. And so maybe that's why it's confusing trying to figure out exactly where Kant stands, is because he, like a lot of other individuals, his beliefs and his understandings shift and change over time. And so maybe that's why it's somewhat foggy, or at least that's why it seems to have been foggy for me when it comes to him, and certainly with other writers as well. People change, people develop. Hopefully you're changing, hopefully you're developing. What you used to think was true, maybe you don't think is true anymore. That's pretty normal, and I think we have to allow Kant to do the same thing. All right, so he does want to develop, though, a moral system that is not based on religion and that is not based on some type of religious faith. This would give it the force of he wants to base it on logic, right? And so this would give it the force of a logical proof as opposed to being contingent on particular facts of the case. Both his general philosophy and ethics are complex, and that's kind of an understatement. But they have the elegance of an elaborate mechanism, and if we accept the basic axioms, his conclusions follow what he is saying, and the essential points are fairly straightforward. And what that means is that, yes, it's large, it's elegant, and often it's difficult, but he is basing it on logic, and he is trying to be logical as he moves forward. And so he's laying it out in a logically progressive way. And if you accept those conclusions, like we talked about early in the semester, premise, conclusion, if you accept those premises, if you follow the premises to his conclusion, you'll see that there is a kind of a logical purity that goes along with the Kantian perspective on ethics. Kant believes motive is the key to assessing morality. He believes that our acts are governed by our will, whose purity will determine how ethical an act is, right? Now this goes back to that idea and the understanding that what matters is the purity of your motives. And if your motives are pure, then the action is pure. The consequences don't matter. He surveys human character, considers qualities such as courage, cleverness, resolution, and perseverance, and decides that while they are generally desirable, they can be diverted in various ways depending on the character of the person involved. Now, what that means is that when you look at something like courage, for example, that's usually considered a virtue. And here I'm going to use those words, virtue and vice. So virtue being something that's good, it's a good characteristic. Vice being something that's a bad characteristic. And so usually courage is considered to be a virtue. It's usually a good characteristic or a good attribute for humans to have. But think about it for just a moment. Couldn't you pervert courage? Couldn't you turn it into a vice? Aren't there plenty of criminals, or aren't there plenty of morally reprehensible individuals who are courageous? They have a certain amount of courage that is involved. If you're going to be a bank robber, I'm going to assume here that robbing banks is bad. If you are going to be a bank robber, it takes a certain amount of courage to walk in there and to do that. And so courage can be twisted. It can become a vice. It depends on how you use it. And so that's one of the reasons that Kant is saying here is that the purity of the action is what determines whether or not, the purity of the motives is what determines whether or not something is good or bad, because courage in and of itself, just behaving courageously, is not necessarily behaving morally, because courage can be a vice. The same thing is going to be true for cleverness. Now, cleverness can be tremendously a good thing. It can be a virtue, but it can also be twisted and be a vice. Resolution, that's usually a virtue, but it can be twisted so that it's a vice. Perseverance, all of these different things. So as Kant goes through these different attributes, he sees that they can be virtues, but he also begins to understand that all of them can be twisted into some way so that they can become a vice. And that's why he keys in on the will or the motives, and he says that there's only one attribute that is purely virtuous and that cannot be twisted into into a vice, and he says that that is the goodwill. If someone has a goodwill, if they're really always trying to do the right thing for the right reasons, if they're really trying to be good for goodness sake, you can't twist that. That can't be made into a vice. It's only virtuous, and it can only be virtuous because the moment you try to twist it, it no longer is the goodwill, it becomes something else. And so the goodwill is the only characteristic, it's the only attribute that can't be twisted into a vice, and that's why he keys in on it and hones in on it and says, as long as that person is trying to do the right thing, what they're doing is trying to willfully do the morally correct things, then that is what morality should be based on, because that is what cannot be twisted. You can't twist that into a vice. So, since motivation is the key to is the key element to all moral decision making, one can never treat others as a means to an end, right? So you can't use other people as a means to an end. You have to be working for the good of those individuals, and you have to be doing it simply because you want the good for those individuals. You can't be doing it. So, for example, a political candidate can't be working for the good of their constituents in order to keep their votes, because they're thinking of consequences, and that's not a goodwill, because their motives aren't pure. What are their motives? Their motives are to stay in office, which means then, according to Kant, then that's not morally pure, because they're thinking of those consequences. The same thing would be true, say, of a person who was feeding the hungry. As long as that person is feeding the hungry, and their goodwill is having them try to feed the hungry because they want the hungry to be fed, and that's their only motivation, then their motive is pure and their will is good. But as soon as they start feeding the good in order to gain the applause of others, then their motive has been twisted and it's bad, because they're doing it for these reasons over here as opposed to just doing it in order that these individuals would not be hungry. And so that goodwill is what Kant is going to hone in on. He's going to say, that determines if something is morally acceptable or not acceptable. Now, this thinking about the goodwill, it leads Kant to what he calls the categorical imperative. Right? Now, the categorical imperative. Categorical imperative just is this: always act in such a way that the maxim of your action can be willed as a universal law of humanity. I'm going to read it again. Always act in such a way that the maxim of your action can be willed as a universal law of humanity. Now, what does that mean? In a sentence, what that means is always act in such a way that you would want everyone else to act towards you and towards each other, right? And so the idea here is that acting in such a way that you would universalize that action. So if you don't want other people to lie to you, right? If you think lying is wrong, and you're understanding it as this universal concept, right? So we wouldn't want everyone to lie all the time, right? So Kant says then, always tell the truth. It's universal in the sense of that it applies to all humans, and it applies in every situation, right? Every situation. So never lie. It's universal across humanity. You would not want people to lie universally. You don't want people to steal and cheat universally. So never steal, never cheat, never lie. And he says, and it's always to be true across all humanity. It's a categorical imperative that is a universal. It's a universal. It applies to everyone. Kant asks us to consider what would happen if everyone decided to lie and steal and make those principles universal to the whole species. We wouldn't want to live within a society or within a culture where lying and stealing were the norm, were the things that were considered the right things to do. Imagine the kind of distrust that would be just rampant within our societies. Everything would break down. Kant formulates the categorical imperative in three ways. He thinks, Kant formulates the categorical imperative in three ways that he thinks amount to the same thing. The common thread is his view of human nature. He believes that we're all rational and free to make choices, right? Now, two things there, right, within Kant. He believes that we're free, we have free will. And second, he believes that we're all rational and that we can all see and think logically, and that we should all act then. We should all behave and act logically all of the time. He believes that we're all rational and that we make free choices. Thus, he said, when I see a person, I should recognize and respect him or her as a moral agent. And so when he says that when we see other people walking around out there, we should understand them as someone who is also free and capable of reasoning and making decisions just like we are, so then each individual is responsible for recognizing rational moral choices and acting accordingly. And so we can all see the categorical imperative, and we all know. Now remember that with Kant and deontology, we all have an obligation, and we all have that moral law that is within us. We all know that is right, that lying is right, that lying is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that cheating is wrong. All these things are wrong. We all know it. We all have that moral law within us. We're all rational. We know that we wouldn't want others to continuously treat us, doing those things to us, cheat, lie, steal. Wouldn't want those things. Since we all know that that's true for all of us, then we should behave according to the categorical imperative, and we should always be rational, and then we should always do the right thing. Not lie, not cheat, not steal. Right? So, duty then, that this type of duty that Kant is talking about and thinking about here, it must be something that is freely imposed by the individual on themselves. It cannot come from an outside source. And what Kant means here is that if you're doing your duty, if you're doing what's required of you, because someone else over here is forcing you to do it, then your will is not pure. You're not doing it because you want to do it, or because you feel obligated to do it. You're doing it because this individual over here is making you do it, and therefore your will is not free. And so your duties and your obligations, that obligation must be something that you put on yourself, that you decide for yourself, I am going to behave in this way. It cannot come from an outside source. It must be internal. Remember, the law is inside of us. It's inside of us. It must be something that we impose on ourselves. And so one of the classic misunderstandings of deontology comes to us from a character, from a historical character by the name of Adolf Eichmann. And Eichmann was part of the Nazi Party during World War II, and Eichmann's job in World War II was he was a train coordinator, and what he did is he organized the schedule for the trains that were shipping Jews to the concentration camps. And he was a very efficient bureaucrat. He was a very organized, very efficient manager of the train schedules. And if you think about trying to schedule trains, I mean, it has to be, you need to maximize track time, right? You always want the tracks to be in use, and it needs to be that two trains are never going to meet on those tracks, and there's going to be lots of different places that they can, go and get off this track and start on this track, and you always want to have the trains moving, but never running into each other. And so Eichmann was actually really, really good at keeping the trains running on a really, really tight schedule. And after World War II, when Eichmann was put on trial, he was put on trial there at Nuremberg with some of the other Nazi war criminals. They brought him up, the charges that they brought him up on were crimes against humanity. Now, think about it for just a second here. When it comes to like free will, compatibilism, and determinism, because in the 1900s, the world was starting to move further and further away from this theory that of this kind of universal moral law that comes to us through, say, a divine source, and through a different series, and each country was in a different place. But if you look at Europe, Europe was further along on that particular track towards stepping away from the idea of the divine law, that somehow there's a deity who's giving us moral laws. And so they were a little further on the track than America, in the sense of that they're moving towards a more naturalistic perspective. Now, once you get the Nazis doing what they're doing, if there is no moral law that's coming from a deity that's saying that this is wrong, then where is the moral law coming from? And as they're talking to and about the, that with regards to and around the Nazis, you get this crimes against humanity phrase that begins to come up, that it's something that comes out of us, but that there are certain things that are so atrocious that they cannot and ought not to exist. They ought never be done. And so herding the Jews, herd, not hurting, but herding like cows, herding the Jews onto trains and then herding them into the different the gas chambers and the different things, the different ways that they abused and killed the Jews in World War II. That these types of crimes were outrageous. And so Eichmann is being held accountable here. What's interesting, what's funny about this particular character is that one of the Jewish reporters that was there watching the trial, she reported saying that you would have thought that Eichmann would have been this huge moral monster, that you would have had this feeling of revulsion and almost the devil, incarnate, meaning the devil put on flesh, almost like Satan himself was in the room. So atrocious were the actions of this man. And she said that's not what you got when you saw Eichmann, but rather what you got was this feeling of kind of this powerless bean counter is the only way I can, and this is my word now, the bean counter. He really is someone who just counted beans and put them in a sack and shipped them off. And so if you've ever worked in any type of industrial situation where you need 50, I'm just going to stick with beans, you need 50 beans in a can. A bean counter is just someone who sits there and 1, 2, 3, 4. They're the perfect bureaucrat. And with Eichmann, you didn't get the sense that he had any particular hatred for the Jews. Indeed, he almost seemed to think of them as beans, really, just to be counted. And all he was really doing was putting them on a train to move them from one place to another. But he really wasn't thinking about the moral question, and he really wasn't thinking about the humanity of the individuals on the train. He was really just doing his job. Now, as you're sitting there and you're thinking about Eichmann, he's just putting these people on trains and he's just doing his job. There's a story that comes down to us about Eichmann, who one time there was a train that came in with people bound for the concentration camp, and one of the prisoners on the train spoke to one of the guards and said, he pointed at Eichmann. He said, "I know that man. I'm a friend of his." And the guard was reluctant to take him over to Eichmann, but eventually the prisoner convinced him that if he didn't take him, and then when Eichmann found out what had happened to this man, that the guard, could be severely punished. And so the guard did, in fact, take the man to Eichmann, and he was, in fact, one of Eichmann's friends. And the story goes that Eichmann, as he, the man is walking up to him with the guard, and he looks at him, he's like, greets him, and, "What are you doing here?" And the man says, "Well, I'm on this train, and I'm bound for this concentration camp over here." And reportedly, what Eichmann did is he laughed and slapped the guy on the back and was like, my, what a pickle we have gotten ourselves into. And so, well, let's just see what the situation is. And Eichmann checked his documentation and found that the man was in fact supposed to be on this train headed to that concentration camp. And he's like, "Well, your name's on the list, so I guess you belong on the train." So he put him on the train. I mean, it was just that kind of concept where, and he just, kind of scratches him off like so many other people would do. and keeps his friend off the train. Of, hey, you're on the train. Now put the bean back on the train. And when you listen to Eichmann as he's defending himself there at Nuremberg, here is a quote from Eichmann. He said, well, this is a quote from the Jewish reporter I was talking about, and within it there is a quote from Eichmann. And so here is basically what Eichmann says, and then at the end there'll be a snippet from the reporter. So here's Eichmann. I had known the categorical imperative, but it was in a nutshell, in a summarized form. I supposed it could be summarized as: be loyal to the laws, be disciplined person, live an orderly life, do not conflict with the laws. And then here's the Jewish reporter. She said, that more or less was the whole essence of that law for the use of the little man. Right? Eichmann being a small individual, by the way. Kant would not have recognized the categorical imperative or the deontological construct as Eichmann is using it here, because it is fantastically important for Kant that duty and obligation comes from within us. It comes from within us. It's a choice and it's an obligation that we impose on ourselves. So with Eichmann, he says, I'm just doing my job. In other words, the Nazi Party placed me here in this bean counter position where I am in control of the trains. And my job was just to move trains. And so what I did is I just moved trains. Why are you punishing me for just doing my job, is kind of the idea. Kant would look at that and he would say no to Eichmann. He would say, you should have known. There's something inside of you, that moral law is inside of you. And if you knew the destination of these individuals, you should have been doing everything you could to disrupt that, because your duty and your obligation was to behave according to the moral law that is within you, not the moral law that is being imposed upon you by those on the outside. So he would not have recognized that the idea here that Eichmann is conveying of this categorical imperative. That is not what Kant was trying to say, and he would not have accepted Eichmann's actions as being part of the duty and that obligation. Your duty and obligation doesn't come from the law of the land or from any other power source. It comes from within you, from within yourself. And so the starry sky above me, that moral law that's within me, and I have to listen to the moral law that's within me. Okay. So a person should always act so that the maxims of his or her actions could rationally be willed as a universal law, so that everyone, you would want everyone to do it. And so, you know, if you don't want everyone stealing office supplies, then you shouldn't steal office supplies from where you work either. Why not? Well, universally, you can't will that everyone do that. Since you can't will that everyone does that, you can't do it. It has to be universal. So if you're performing an action that you wouldn't want everyone else to perform, then it's morally wrong for you to do it. Number 2, within the categorical imperative, act. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case, as an end withal, never as a means only. And what that means is that you can't use people as a means to an end. You have to be acting in a way to try to bring to them something that's good to them or for them, but you can't be using them. So you can never use people to try to get ahead or to try to get something for yourself. You've always got to be behaving in such a way that you're trying to maximize what's good for them. Not just maximize what's good for you. So you can never use a person. Now, a bit of clarification here. If a business hires an employee, they're using that person in a sense because they're trying to sell a product. We'll just say trying to sell a product. In a way, they're using that person because they're using the person to sell a product. On the other hand, isn't the person who's working there, aren't they using the business? Because they're using them as a means to an end, the end being they're trying to make a living. And it's the means is that they're, giving their time to this company selling this product. That's not what Kant is saying. You can do that as long as both parties are free to hire and to accept the job. And so that's a mutual beneficial relationship. So you're both getting something from it. And so it's not simply the using of another individual or company in that case for a means to an end, but you're both benefiting. And that's acceptable. That's just cooperation. That's not someone being abused. Now, if a business is abusing an employee, or if an employee is abusing a business, then that's different. But in this case, you can have that kind of mutually beneficial relationship. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, also, ethical people should always act as both subjects and sovereigns in the kingdom of ends. What that means is that people are autonomous creatures, and so we come to rational conclusions with regard to moral laws, and then we are then duty bound to follow those laws. Right now, what does that mean? Okay. First of all, what does it mean to be autonomous? Autonomy comes from two Greek words. The first one's auto, and the second one is auto, just means self, and then the second word is nomos, which just means law. And so if you're autonomos, if you're self-law, that doesn't really quite work very well in English. So what we say is that we're self-governed. And so you govern yourself. If you have a car that's an automobile, just thinking about these two words, they're self-propelled. They are self-mobile. And so with a human, we are self-lawed, we're self-legislated, or we're self-governed. And since we are self-governed, Kant says we have free will, we're autonomous creatures, we come to rational conclusions. Why? Remember, we are rational creatures, right? So we come to rational conclusions about moral laws. And once we can come to this rational conclusion about a moral law, about how we should behave, so for example, again, we know that we shouldn't lie. We can't will that to be universal, and therefore we shouldn't do it. Logically, we should come to the conclusion that since we can't will lying to be universal across the board, then that we should not lie. So we're autonomous. We can choose not to lie. We're rational. We recognize in this case that lying is wrong, and we don't want it to be universal, and therefore we're duty bound to follow the rule, do not lie. Do not lie. Now, with Kant, and finishing the thought, and that's for us to be imposed on ourselves. We impose that don't lie on ourselves. It's not imposed on us by other individuals. Remember, we have to have that pure free will that's free of outside sources, and that somehow we put this on ourselves. And so we don't lie. We don't lie because we're self-legislated. We're free. We can make that choice. We're logical, so we can see that we shouldn't do it. We understand that it shouldn't be universal, and we impose that rule on ourselves. And so Kant says, don't lie. Never lie. Never under any circumstances lie. According to Kant, never under any circumstances. Never lie. Now, think about this for just a moment. Never lie under any circumstances, no matter the consequences. Imagine for a moment that you're standing outside of a building, and you're kind of walking toward that, the front entrance, and suddenly a friend of yours comes running out of the entrance of that building, coming out of the building, and they take off running as hard as they can around the side of the building, and then a few moments later, a person with a revving chainsaw comes running out of the building, obviously pursuing your friend. The person with the chainsaw looks at you and says, "Which way did they go?" You can't lie. Okay? Imagine that you're in World War II and the Nazis are doing house-to-house searches for Jews, and you're hiding Jews in your attic. I'm thinking Diary of Anne Frank here, right? you're hiding Jews in your attic, and they knock on your door and they ask you, are you hiding any Jews? You can't lie. Kant says never lie. Never ever, under any circumstances. Now, in the case of the revving chainsaw, in the case of the Nazis hunting Jews, there is an out in that Kant says you can't lie, but he says that you can remain silent. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to lie, but you can simply not say anything. But think about it for just a moment. Is this really an out? Is that really something that's going to help you? If the Nazis are hunting Jews and they look at you and they say, are you hiding any Jews in your house? And you say nothing, I mean, you're basically saying, yes, you're saying something without saying something, aren't you? Now, with Kant and never lie, one of the really interesting and I think probably telling things about Kant is that he never married. I think that probably this idea here reveals a little bit about perhaps Kant maybe not quite fully appreciating the need to be able to not tell the truth 100% of the time. If the wife comes in and says, does this make my butt look big? And he remains silent, he has answered the question. And that's also, by the way, ladies, not fair, right? Don't ask your husband that question unless you want the answer to be, yes, dear, and I love your big, your big posterior. That's the only way you should ask that question, is if you want the answer to be yes, and your husband perhaps likes big butts and cannot lie. Maybe then that's okay and acceptable. But with Kant, is it really possible? Is it feasible? Is it even good, really, to say never lie under any circumstances? There's a really interesting movie that deals a little bit with this particular question called Liar, Liar. And while I'm often hesitant to recommend a movie, it's pretty good, although you kind of have to get through some of the Jim Carrey moments because he is Jim Carrey. And parts of it aren't fully and completely PG, just so you know. But it is a movie that deals with an individual who lies out of habit. I mean, he just lies habitually, and he lies to everyone constantly. And so his son, Max, Max makes a birthday wish that his father couldn't lie for 24 hours. And so Jim Carrey's character then, he's a lawyer. He winds up in multiple situations where he can't lie. He wants to lie. He tries to lie, and he can't do it. And the truth is just constantly being told. And so the movie really reveals how it's important to tell the truth, but it also reveals how sometimes it's important to be able to lie or not quite fully be honest. You can remove or omit certain aspects. And so it is actually a thought-provoking movie, obviously, too. It's also humorous in some situations, but it is a thought-provoking movie about the concept of the importance of being honest, but also the importance of being able to be dishonest as well. Because when he can't be dishonest, his world just kind of it doesn't run smoothly, I guess. Anyway, what about the idea never steal, right? Because you can't universalize the idea of always steal. You can't possibly walk around in a civilization where everybody's always trying to steal. So what about the concept here of never steal, never ever, under any circumstances, Kant would say steal, because you can't make it universal. Is there ever a good time for someone to perhaps to steal? Obviously, always Robin Hood comes to mind, robbing the rich to feed the poor. Maybe that's a good time to do it, I don't know. But is there ever a time, perhaps, when it might be the right thing to do? And so when I think of this don't steal thing with Kant, I always remember a story that was told of LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York City during the Great Depression. And while he was the mayor, um, he was a very much loved man. He was small in stature, and he always wore a carnation in his lapel. When the newspapers went on strike, he went on the radio and read like the Sunday funnies to the kids. You know, you're thinking 1920s and 30s here. So being on the radio, reading the funny papers to the kids because the newspapers aren't coming out, and funny papers and all. So he cared about the kids with the comic strips and that type of thing. But he really was a much loved man, and I think for many reasons and good ones. As the mayor, he had the right, he had the power to sit as judge in the court rooms in New York City. And so one night he went to one of the poorest districts of New York City, and he dismissed the judge for the evening. And he sat on the bench. He always wore a sombrero, by the way, and so he took the sombrero off and had that laying on the bench in front of him. And he sat through a couple of cases and made judgments, and then before too long, a very obviously poor and disheveled grandmother was brought to him, and she was accused by one of the local grocers of stealing a loaf of bread. And as LaGuardia listened to the grandmother telling her part of the story, it turns out that the grandmother had two grandchildren who were starving to death, and her daughter, the grandmother's daughter, the mother of the children, was so sick that she could not work. And now you're also thinking in this time Great Depression, which means there was not a lot of work. If you had a job, you were particularly lucky, and you weren't making much money anyway. And so these individuals were starving. The grandmother was too old to work, the daughter was too sick to work, and the kids were too young to work. What can they do? And there's the depression, and so they're starving to death. She's trying to steal a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren. And LaGuardia is sitting there, and he looks at the grocer, and he says, I mean, now you've heard her story. Do you still want to press charges? And the grocer said, yes. He said, it's a bad neighborhood, and somebody needs to be made an example of. And so LaGuardia looks at the grocer, he looks at the grandmother, and he's like, well, the law is the law. I mean, I have to follow the law. And you can almost hear that Kantian perspective coming out here, in that you have to do your duty. You have an obligation. As a mayor and as a judge in that situation, he has an obligation to do what the law requires. And so he looks at the grandmother and he says, I fine you, $10 or 10 days in jail. Now, LaGuardia knows, and the grandmother and the grocer know, that she can't afford $10. She doesn't have 10 cents. And so she can't spend 10 days in jail either, because by the time she gets out, the daughter and the grandchildren will have starved as well. And so as he's pronouncing judgment, LaGuardia pulled out his wallet, and he took out $10 and he threw it into his sombrero, and he paid the fine. And that would have been amazing enough, but he did something else. The next thing he did was really, really genius, because he said, I fine you, $10 or 10 days in jail. He pulls out the $10, he pays the fine, and he says, further though, I fine everyone in the courtroom 50 cents each for living in a city where a grandmother has to steal in order to feed her grandchildren. And so I think it was $72.50 or something like that was collected from everyone in the courtroom. 50 cents. Everybody in the courtroom was fined. Because he looked around and he said, look, we're all here in this city together. We're all part of this human condition. We're all part of this experience. And if we're living in a city where a grandmother and her grandchildren are starving to death so much so that they have to steal, that is also a great atrocity. And so something within, Kant would say, something within LaGuardia was roused, and something that starry sky above, that moral law within, was touched, and so that he fined everybody else and said, this with the grandmother and the grandchildren ought never to happen. Categorical imperative. They should not starve to death on our watch. And so this bewildered grandmother received this $72.50. And I think the funniest part, the best part of that, is that 50 cents of that money came from the grocer who was pressing charges. I'm sure he was not pleased at all because perhaps the grandmother didn't learn the lesson that he was hoping for, but maybe the grocer or perhaps some of the people in the courtroom learned the lesson that they were supposed to learn, and perhaps we will learn the lesson that we're supposed to learn as well. When we look at Kant with the categorical imperative, never lie, it sure seems like there's times we might have to be able to do that. Or never steal. And it sure seems like there might be times when we have to do that. So maybe the categorical imperative works, but maybe I think the categorical imperative reveals something to us that is majorly important, in that we should come to recognize that there seems to be something inside of us that does recognize that moral law within. What comes next from it is perhaps not exactly what Kant outlines, but it does seem that there are those categorical imperatives. Are there really those categorical imperatives where it just is the case that, and these things should never happen? Is it really truly the case that no grandmother should ever be forced to steal in order to feed her grandchildren? That might be a categorical imperative where that's, it's always wrong that grandmothers are put into the condition where they and their grandchildren are having to steal. I don't know. But it seems to be a difficulty for Kant in his particular position with that categorical imperative. Always, always tell the truth, never lie, never steal. Seems to be some kind of difficulty there. Another weakness, another difficulty for deontology. Kant pays so much attention to duty and to that people should behave according to their obligations, that he neglects the emotions of the person who's making the decision. And so he doesn't think about the emotion that is going to be part of the person who's behaving. Consequences don't matter. And so if you have emotional revulsion to a certain activity, it's just some kind of moral obligation that you feel, you have to ignore the emotion because the emotion is just a consequence of the action, and so it has to be ignored. It can't be something that you take in as part of the equation, because you're supposed to be non-emotional. You're supposed to be unemotional. You're supposed to be purely rational and reasoning, purely logical when it comes to trying to make these types of moral decisions. The problem with that is that I've mentioned before, is that humans are both reason, they both have logic, and they have reason. I'm sorry, both have logic or reason, and they have emotion. We are creatures that incorporate both of those aspects, and Kant is asking us simply to ignore one aspect here, in that he's asking us not to think about the emotions, not to worry about the emotions, because he says emotions can be fickle. That is, that they can change. They can, they're whimsical, and so one day you might be emotional in this direction, and another day you might be emotional in this direction. But when it comes to logic, logic always runs in the same direction and in the same pathway, whereas emotions can pull us aside from one place to another. And so if today I'm particularly, I'm losing the word here. If I'm particularly compassionate, there it is, that's what I was looking for. If I'm particularly compassionate when I see one situation, I might decide that this particular action is moral. And if another day I'm not particularly feeling very compassionate, but I'm feeling a little more hard-nosed and just kind of, whatever towards the human condition, then I might take this position when it comes to morality. And so Kant looks at that in those emotions, and he says, emotions are fickle. You can go one way or the other depending on the day and your mood or whatever else. And so he says, don't think about those when it comes to making your moral decisions. Just use logic. Again, part of the trouble is that we're rational, we're logical, but we're also emotional. There's certainly an emotional aspect that comes with humanity, and that as I am behaving morally, I have to consider the emotional consequences of the moral actions that I'm taking. Kant says consequences don't matter and emotions don't matter. He wants us simply to rid ourselves of those, but that's not the kind of creatures that we are. If I decide that this is the right way to behave, part of that should be the consideration of the emotional consequences of what I'm about to do or not do. Those should be part of the decision-making process, and Kant just says you should throw them away. One of the reasons I say that they should be part of our process of making moral decisions is that our emotions allow us to perceive the world in a very, very important way that logic does not allow us to perceive the world. If we're just logical creatures who make decisions solely based on, this is the logical process, then we can't look at a starving child and have that emotional pull that says, and I wouldn't want that to happen to my child. Because that's an emotional pull, Kant would have us disregard it. But those types of emotions allow us to perceive the world in very important ways, which tugs at our that moral law within, and therefore perhaps try to help feed the starving children. Why? Because I wouldn't want my children to starve, right? And so there has to be both the logic and the emotion that helps pull us towards these rational but also emotional moral decisions, and Kant wants us to get rid of the emotion. I think that's a pretty big weakness because we are emotional creatures. Now, if we were just logical creatures, then it wouldn't be a problem, but we're not. We're also emotional creatures. And so I think that needs to be part of the decision-making process. Another weakness there with Kant is that while Kant realized consequences are not all that counts, he does fail to realize and take into account that sometimes they do count. He just says, don't worry about consequences, and I don't think that that's fully and completely moral. It might be that they don't count for everything. Certainly a good will matters, and while the road to hell might be paved with good intentions, we certainly want that people have good intentions. That's certainly part of a moral landscape, that people really do have the goodwill, that they really are trying to do the right thing. We want that. That's part of morality as well. Certainly, I think that's what Kant brings to the table in this case. As we'll see in utilitarianism, that's totally discounted, and the goodwill doesn't matter. All that matters is that that good consequences come about, and I'm not sure that that's moral either. You have to be doing it with good intentions as well, perhaps. There you go. There's a little bit more of my personal opinion. I didn't really want to just. You don't have to agree, but I think that's that goodwill matters, but consequences also matter. And Kant just comes in and says, don't worry about consequences. You can't control the consequences, therefore they don't matter. Just behave, according to your goodwill. Just behave logically. And so I think it's important that Kant pointed out to us. It's very helpful that he pointed out to us that consequences aren't all that mattered, but he wanted to completely rid all situations of consequences having importance, and I think that's a misstep when it comes to trying to make moral decisions as well. Right, so those weaknesses, just a couple of the weaknesses of deontology, and there are others, but this is, it's an introductory course in philosophy. You're being introduced to deontology there. Some of the struggles, some of the weaknesses for deontology, I think. Okay. This last part, really, really quickly. Something that I do in my classes, and so I wanted to give it to you just so you would have the full experience of Introduction to Philosophy, I suppose, but something to think about, nothing that you have to write about. Don't include this in any essay or whatever, just some reflection for yourself. Most of us do live by rules. Pick up your room, make your bed, eat your vegetables, don't hit your sister, whatever the rules might be. Most of us live by some kinds of rules. What I would have you consider, quickly, what are the most important rules you live by? And as I listen to my students, I get things like, be basically honest. Not quite as honest as Kant would have us be, but be basically honest. Take care of your family. Family first. Uh, Live in such a way that your mother would, not be ashamed of you if your actions were put on the cover of Life magazine. Yeah, that's a pretty good rule. What kind of rules do you live by? Second, what rules are what rules did your family have? What rules did your family make that they had you live by? And so with my family, there were a lot of different rules. Not in a horrible way, but there were lots of kind of family rules. One of them was that family is important. We spent a lot of time together as a family. Um, Dinner table time mattered, and we had a lot of intellectual discussions there at the dinner table. And so that was one of the rules. We always sat down together to eat. Um, and then finally, what rules have you rejected as you've gotten older? Because lots of times the rules that your family have, we grow in different ways. Once we leave the house, we grow in a different way, so that this rule, perhaps we don't live by. Perhaps we add a rule over here. And so just for your own personal reflection, what are the most important rules that you live by? What are the most important rules that your family has? And what rules have you rejected that came from your family as you've gotten older? Just something to reflect on and think about as we move forward. And so next time we'll be talking about John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, and we will see you then.